Thank you, and thank you for inviting me today. I'm not going to really go through this PowerPoint because I'm going to try to focus the discussion a little bit more on what local governments can do and what we did in Guilford in the process of preparing a coastal resilience plan. First, I'd like to maybe learn a little bit about you all. How many of you live in towns that are, say, have a population of 50,000 or under, or cities or towns? How many of you live within walking distance or a short bike ride or maybe a view of saltwater? And how many of you would like to live within a location like that? Okay. Guilford is a very desirable community from both of those perspectives. It is a small town, has a population of about 25,000 people. It is located on Long Island Sound, about 15 miles east of New Haven. Its coastline is a very desirable place to live. There is a small industrial area on the shoreline, which I'll relate to in a few minutes. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But it's primarily single-family homes, primarily affluent homeowners, becoming more and more affluent every day. Even during the Great Recession, it was the one area of development activity that was continuing, people buying smaller cottages for the most part, converting them into larger homes. That's the development experience that we've had. It's a historic town, and there's a lot to protect from the standpoint of coastal resilience, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of the plan development. This project actually began before Hurricane Sandy, about a year before actually. It was motivated in part by a partner of ours in the planning process, the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy developed and is still in the process of developing with their partners in the scientific community projections of sea level rise, and they wanted to identify some local governments in Connecticut to partner with them to develop model coastal resilience plans. We were fortunate in Guilford to be selected by them, and they became our partner. We secured funding from NOAA to help with the planning process, and we also were joined by some academic, with some academic assistance from Yale, the Yale School of Architecture and the Yale School of Environmental Studies, became partners with us in this project. I'm going to advance this slides here, or try to.
I'll do my best to keep up.
Is this, yeah, move it forward quite a bit. Will this, does this work? There we go.
Oh, you got it. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Start with this slide, which does show the coastline of Connecticut. I mean, of Guilford. It's made up. The town's made up of about 6 separate kind of residential neighborhoods, separated by either rocky shoreline or tidal marsh. The town is blessed with extensive tidal marshes, and over on the east side, which would be the right-hand side, there is a small industrial neighborhood, which I'll talk about in a minute. The planning process began, as I mentioned, before Sandy and before Irene, another coastal storm that actually in some ways impacted Connecticut more than Sandy. Began with the projections of sea level rise and the discussions about what we would like to do, what we'd like to plan in the way of a more resilient future for the town. The impact of Sandy and Irene, of course, was tremendous, and it really focused the attention of our citizens and especially our property owners and residents on the need to do this type of planning. In Connecticut, local governments are required to prepare plans of conservation and development, so-called, and we envisioned that the Coastal Resilience Plan, which we have currently in a draft state, will become part of the Plan of Conservation and Development, and as such it will become the official land use and community development policy of the town. The plan will also become part of an amendment to another planning document that the town has called a hazard mitigation plan, which many of you may be familiar with. This is actually a federally FEMA-motivated planning process which enables local governments to secure funding through FEMA if you have an approved hazard mitigation plan. And we envision that this coastal resilience plan will become part of the hazard mitigation plan and therefore enable us to secure FEMA funding for some of the recommendations of the plan. One of the things that was particularly relevant to our citizens was the effect of Sandy and the inundation that resulted from Sandy, and it's the correlation of those sea level rise inundation with the sea level rise projections. The Nature Conservancy projections were based on relatively short-term projections, 2020, also 2050 projections, and 2080 projections. And the extent of inundation of Sandy came very close to the level of inundation that's projected in these scenarios. So it was very a relevant experience for us, and again focused the attention of our citizens on this process. The planning project went through some fairly conventional steps, including assessment of vulnerabilities, and led to a series of recommendations which we could characterize as sort of short-term recommendations. The short-term recommendations included infrastructure improvements. In our case, many of our coastal neighborhoods, which you can see to some extent on this map, the housing in the residential neighborhoods are relatively high, although access to those neighborhoods is frequently problematic in storm events and also at times of high tide. And so the implication of a 1 or 2 foot rise in sea level to those neighborhoods was significant, and that led to a series of recommendations for road and access improvements. The town's actually started to build some of those improvements already as a result of citizen pressure, if you will, for improvements. In the medium term, the plan called for some protective infrastructure improvements, mostly in the green variety. And as a matter of fact, we proceeded to implement one aspect of that work, which is a tidal marsh protection project with the placement of dredge materials from one of our harbor and river dredging projects in an area of mud flats, which will, if the designers are correct, will enable us to preserve a tidal wetland area which has been subject to extensive erosion over the years. Medium-term recommendations also include zoning changes mostly relating to so-called freeboard standards, increased freeboard standards for new construction, and also to the improvements in the design of single-family homes in coastal areas that are subject to flooding or potentially subject to flooding. Long-term neighborhood-based plans are what I'd like to focus on in concluding this discussion. I think it was probably a Boston politician who said something like, all politics is local. We've heard several times this morning some suggestions that resiliency planning is really something that's done at the local level, and I couldn't agree more with that. I think what we've learned in our planning process so far is that resiliency planning is really a neighborhood-based planning program, especially when the planning projects envision relocation, redevelopment, property acquisition. That's a concept that especially small towns and small governments don't have a lot of experience with, and we feel that if we're going to make this acceptable to our citizens, we have to have buy-in and participation from the residents and property owners within our neighborhoods. You probably can't really see too much of this, but this is a neighborhood called Soundview Road, which is actually an industrial neighborhood. The blue shows rather dramatically the extent of a couple of different storm events and the impact that that has on the properties within that district. This shows the several different categories of development in this industrial neighborhood now. The areas that are shown in red are places that are extremely vulnerable to flooding even now. Blue to a lesser extent, and yellow not so much, even in the long term. The plan suggests that in the short term, some businesses might want to relocate from the red areas, and then in the long term, this concept envisions a significant transformation in this industrial neighborhood from a neighborhood that's mostly residential now and also has extensive tidal marsh and other environmental and open space resources. How we get from the first step in this to the third step is a challenge for sure. But one thing I can say is that it won't happen without the participation and cooperation of the property owners. This is another neighborhood plan example. Neighborhood Seaside Avenue. It's an area of residential development. Again, the blue shows extensive inundation from, in this case, Sandy, which, as I mentioned before, replicates, I believe, the 2050 sea level rise scenarios. So there's significant potential for inundation and change in that neighborhood. This map shows the location pretty much of existing development in the black dots. These are single-family homes. This graphic, which I'm sure you can't read, shows some suggestions for how parts of that neighborhood might be compromised and where some of the dwelling units might be relocated or acquired. The areas shown in green, for example, are single-family homes that will probably should be relocated. The area in yellow shows an area where some new development might occur to sort of capture and accommodate some of that new development. This shows a further stage in that evolution, perhaps. And then finally, this shows the transformation of that neighborhood in a really dramatic way, perhaps including some of the building types that were discussed just a few minutes ago as examples from Holland and other places. The transformation from the current condition into a neighborhood like this is, of course, very dramatic. On the one hand, it might scare property owners who are residents in that who are living in that neighborhood now, but we've tried to characterize this as something that can be achieved with the participation and cooperation and partnership with the property owners in the neighborhood. That's really the only way it can be achieved under the kind of political dynamics that we have today. Coastal adaptation will occur over a long period of time, obviously. I couldn't agree more, and I certainly endorse the suggestions earlier that local governments need help in building coastal resilience plans. They need help from the state in particular, not only in financial terms necessarily. I think in a town like Guilford, which is very wealthy, doesn't need the financial help, but we do need, and many of our partner towns and cities need assistance in developing planning, expertise, and capability. And local governments also need additional authority to especially carry out some of the more dramatic kinds of redevelopment that I think many of our coastal neighborhoods are going to require. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much.